That what we've tried to do here is to treat painting as simply another historical artifact. And also to show, of course, that Tudor portraits and Tudor paintings are almost always associated with words. So this is an exhibition about words. This is an exhibition about a man who was unusually verbal, who unusually, for a king of England, most kings of England were adept orally in several languages. Remember, the English then were good linguists, because nobody spoke English. English is much less important than Dutch. About 2.75 million people in the world speak English in the reign of Henry VIII. And it doesn't include anybody important in Europe, including people who spend years here, like Erasmus. They never learn a word. It's utterly insignificant. Interestingly enough, it is exactly in the reign of Henry VIII, as we'll learn in Lecture 3, that for the first time, the argument that English is a great language is invented. So they are multilingual, English, French, Latin, but rarely are they multilingual on paper. Theirs is an oral culture. Henry is the first king to step fully into a written culture. And of course, his upbringing coincides precisely with the rapid development of print. So he is at the center of this verbal revolution. And one of the themes that we use in the exhibition is the pursuit of his handwriting. How it develops, what shapes it, what it does. And you see this hand, rather like, almost like a kind of ghostly emblem, imposing itself in area after area after area. And one of our great delights in the exhibition was to be able to borrow the writing desk from the Victorian Albert Museum, the Henry VIII writing desk, on which certainly, we can't be sure which, of course, because Henry had dozens of writing desks in the same way that he had dozens of palaces. But on this writing desk, we can be quite sure several of the documents that you actually see there were written. So there's a wonderful sense of the word also as something that is physical, something in a moment. I mean, all those of you who are Christian and those of you who are merely, like me, know your Bibles, know again that this idea of the word in the Gospel according to St. John, the idea of God as word, as logos, the word forming and shaping and calling order out of chaos and imposing will upon it, is one of the great Christian ideas. With the reign of Henry VIII, I think we can see that in operation politically in a quite extraordinary way. So, enough of the big themes. Let's come down, as one always must. And again, I think the essential technique of doing history, whether it be on paper, whether it be in an exhibition where you do it three-dimensionally, whether it's on television, which is a kind of, bastard art form rather like opera, but at its best can be just as moving as opera. Would that I could be as good as Puccini, but there we are. It seems to me that all of these forms have in common this attempt at exploration at several different levels, in several different ways, using several different media. And that's what we're going to try to do this evening, to show how they all come together and focus on the one individual, on Henry himself. So, he's born in 1491, in June 1491, in the very pretty Thameside Palace, as yet undevastated by the Equestrian Olympics, called Greenwich, on the borders of the Thames, about 5 miles from London. Remember, London is tiny. London is about 50,000 people, essentially contained within the walls. That's to say, it's almost entirely on the north bank. You can stand and look at London. And if you look at certain of the early sections of the exhibition, you will see a painter called Antonius Weingard did exactly that. He stands on a little bit of elevated ground on the south bank, and he looks at London. Wyatt, in his poem comparing the Thames and the Tagus, compares London to an oxbow. London is also like Venice. It's a city on water. in which all transport is by river. And Greenwich, although it's 5 miles downstream, is extremely easily reached from London by boat. Similarly, the great network of royal palaces that develops to the west of London, like Richmond in Henry's father's reign, Henry VII's favourite palace, is also very easily reached by boat. But centrally, of course, are the two great palaces at either end of the urban complex of London: the Tower at the eastern end, part of the actual walls of the City of London, and then to the west, well outside the walls and connected to the walled city by the line of the Strand, you've got Westminster, which is the palace monastery complex, very much like Edinburgh, with Edinburgh Castle and Holyrood House linked by the Royal Mile. And it's very common in European terms. The thing that's peculiar in English terms is the enormous importance of Westminster. Westminster is everything. All the royal acts, which, for example, in France are scattered through 3 or 4 different important monasteries, all take place there. There a king is crowned with his queen. There he will be buried, usually with his queen, though not invariably. There Parliament meets, there the law courts meet, there the exchequer. Everything is concentrated on this one site. And one of the great and revolutionary changes of Henry's reign is to undo that and malign inheritance to establish Whitehall, from which we're still governed. God help us. Right. So Henry is born at Greenwich. Now, the fact that he's born at Greenwich seems to me to be extraordinarily important. Greenwich is not an official palace at this point. It is essentially the Queen's palace. It's the palace of Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York. It's a maison de retraite. It's a house for private withdrawal and contemplation and the pleasures of the summer, an escape from the stinking heat of the city in late June, when Henry is born. It's also, therefore, a marker of Henry's complete insignificance. The first thing that we've got to realise is this man who puts this quite extraordinary impress on English history. The essential theme of the exhibition is that Henry VIII is the central ruler in English history, that more happens under Henry than at any time in English history since the Norman conquest. And there is no, as it were, collection of changes, I would argue even in the 20th century, that compare with intensity and speed as to what happened in England in the late 1520s, 1530s, and 1540s. He is a truly revolutionary ruler. He bestrides, like Shakespeare's Caesar, the world like a colossus, and even looks like one, 6 foot odd. Caesar doesn't look like a colossus. Caesar is rather sort of feeble and spindly-legged, and like Napoleon has got to brush his hair forward to conceal the fact that he's bald. Henry is truly the colossus at 6'1" or 6'2", but he doesn't begin like that. Obviously, he begins as a baby, but he begins. It's a very good thing, isn't it, to remember everybody important was once a baby. Very, very, very good way of looking at people and not necessarily cutting them down to size, but realizing that they really are genuinely human. Henry is insignificant. Why? Well, he is a royal prince, but he's only a second son. And in those days, the distinction of heir and spare is absolutely fundamental. Look in the exhibition. One of the first documents that you see there is the Book of Hours, that's to say the private devotional aid that Henry's grandmother, the formidable Lady Margaret Beaufort, and one of the things that Andrew and I are most proud of is the Tudor picture gallery that we've been able to construct as you enter the exhibition. And there in the centre, on loan from Queen's College, Cambridge, is the, St John's College, Cambridge, I apologise, is the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, Lady Margaret Beaufort, looking profoundly disapproving at the move that she's had to put up with. She's Henry's grandmother, and she sees herself as both the founder of the dynasty, very self-consciously, the founder of the dynasty, but also its recording angel. And in the calendar, a Roman calendar, of course, with calends and all that sort of thing, at the beginning of her Book of Hours, she uses it in a way which I know my own grandmother still used her Bible, the fly leaves of her Bible, to record important events in the family history. And it's not simply births, marriages, and deaths. The extraordinary process by which her son, Henry VII, became King of England, this bizarre adventure story. You know, Henry VII appears in the textbooks as the chartered accountant king. Nothing could be further from the truth. He's a wild, weird, half French, half Welsh, wholly bizarre adventurer who takes England with 2,500 troops, almost all of whom are French, and 20 little ships. Now the story, the bizarre, wonderful story, which I think is one of the driving forces of Henry's character. How do you match with a father who from nothing becomes king and then goes on to defend his throne twice more in battle in personal combat? This is something that no other king of England does, not even Edward I. It is quite extraordinary record. So she records all of these things, but she also goes on and records the births of her grandchildren. Except with Henry, as you can see if you look at it, she not only doesn't record his birth at the time, it's written as later created Prince of Wales, so that must mean that she doesn't even bother to note his birth until after he's ceased to be spare and become heir. She gets the date wrong, and it's crossed out. So even his grandmother doesn't actually note it, nor does any chronicler. There is no contemporary reference to Henry's birth at all. There's one document which I was able to locate in the Public Records Office, which is really a very strange thing indeed. When you think of the record of a birth of a royal prince, it records spending about £2, 6 shillings and 3p on linen to line the font. That's the record. There's nothing else at all. If you look, though, for his elder siblings, his elder brother Arthur, born in 1486, rather dangerously near his parents' wedding. He's born 8 months after his parents' wedding, so draw your own conclusions. I think actually he's premature. We've all got such dirty minds that we tend to think of other things, don't we? Or his elder sister, Margaret, born in 1489, 2 years before him. Their births are not only recorded accurately by their grandmother, they are recorded to the last hour and minute. And again, enormously elaborate descriptions of their christenings are drawn up by contemporaries. In other words, they're seen as being an important part of the historical and dynastic fabric in a way which Henry isn't. That's the first thing that's very striking about Henry, unimportance. The second thing that those trips to the Public Records Office, now known as the National Archives, in slavish imitation of the United States. Those trips to the Public Records Office long ago, all of which really depended on the work that I did when I was a research student in my early 20s. Now, I am not one who necessarily has the highest regard for academic research. Intellectually, most of the time, it's about as exciting as knitting. I mean, you are really sitting there, flicking through documents, waiting for something to turn up. And the great test is, can you stay awake long enough so that when the important thing comes by, it doesn't slip your attention. Anyway, I managed to learn this crucially important technique of staying awake through boredom. It later on becomes extremely useful if you teach professionally and listen to students read their essays out aloud. You have to have a fixed rictus of interest upon your face. As this, all students have this illusion that they have something important to say, that they're individual. Well, of course, they're sweet, dear things, but normally they just repeat what they've read or what they've discussed with each other, and most essays are totally interchangeable, apart from the colour of the ink and whether they put a round dot on top of the I or not. That's about the... and how florid the sort of sweep up of the Y is. So we've got then this world of to be explored through rather tedious documents. But the tedious documents can reveal the most extraordinary things. And again, along with that little crossing out of Henry's grandmother, which shows that she didn't actually really know when he was born, we have another little clutch of documents there which show who brought up Henry. And the reason we can know this is because they have to be paid. The one thing you can be sure governments record, and we're seeing it deliciously with Emma, is what money's spent on. It's great, you know. And once you know what money's spent on, you on the whole know. You really do. It's, providing you do it imaginatively. Well, our MPs do, don't they? But there we are. You can actually reconstruct extraordinary worlds. And I was able to locate the documents that show who brought Henry up. Now, that will seem a very silly thing. Doesn't his mother bring him up? Answer, no. Of course, in those days, aristocratic women, let alone royal women, even gentlewomen, and I think this is broadly true until the beginning of the 20th century, do not suckle their children. You employ a human milk bottle called a wet nurse, who is a lactating woman who does it for you, which is one of the reasons that aristocratic women have so many babies. Remember, it's very interesting, isn't it? The welfare state has resulted in aristocratic values going to the very bottom of the social pile. If you look in the 16th century, wantonness, wastefulness, squalor, violence, and huge famines were all the privileges of the highest aristocracy. And what we've done with the welfare state, as I said, is to democratize them and move them to the bottom of the social pile. Anyway, one of the reasons for that, of course, is that giving suck offers a form of natural contraception. It helps to delay the onset of another pregnancy. Aristocratic women didn't have that. Anyway, so Henry is not brought up by his mother. He's immediately given into the hands of a wet nurse called Anne Luke. But what is really extraordinary about Henry's upbringing is that he continues to be brought up by women right through to his early teens. And that not only is he brought up by women, he is brought up with his sisters in the same household as his sisters, and that this household in turn, as again these damnable boring lists which you can correlate against each other also show, is very closely associated with his mother's household. So the dominant figure, although she doesn't actually give him suck, the dominant figure in every other way is his mother. And again, we're able to show, I mentioned the whole business of Henry's handwriting, we're able to show by a comparison of his handwriting, his sister Mary's, his sister Margaret's, that's his younger sister Mary, his elder sister Margaret, whom I've mentioned already, and their mother's hand, that it is, I'm not a betting man, but it's 9-1 that he learns to write from his mother. His handwriting is quite extraordinary. It's unlike any other early 16th century hand, apart from those of his sisters. It's completely different from those of his known tutors. It's a very old-fashioned hand. It's a late 15th century hand. And the signs are that he learns to write at his mother's knee. Now, all of this, of course, is very interesting. It gives us a picture which I think I want to put into our minds now as a very important fact to carry forward from Henry's childhood and youth into lectures 2 and 3. It puts into the frame the fact that Henry's upbringing is quite unusually, and I'll establish how unusually in a moment, feminized. He is used to having a lot of women around, and it is clear that he likes it. I mean, one of the great problems, of course, with Henry is why does a man marry 6 times? You will remember Johnson memorably, literally every memorable saying in the language, which isn't Alexander Pope, is Samuel Johnson, describes a second marriage as the triumph of hope over experience. What is a 6th marriage? What sort of triumph is that? Well, there are 2 explanations. One is that a man is contemptuous of women and contemptuous of marriage. The other is that he values it too much. That he has, I would argue, a modern quasi-romantic attitude. That is to say, that he regards marriage and love, in the full Liverpudlian sense of the word, as the same thing. And I think that is what we have with Henry, as I shall try to explore as we go forward with him. And this peculiar upbringing, I am convinced, is central to that. Now, why do I say it's peculiar? Well, I say it's peculiar, I suppose, because I know. It's very, very important to remember that there is such a thing as historical knowledge. It may have been entirely abolished from the national curriculum in terms of the teaching of history, but there are known facts. Okay, they really are, like the fact that on the whole, boys are taken away from women in the early modern period at about the age of 6 and are then given the equivalent of, a public school knocking into shape by men. And with royal princes, it tends to happen very, very much earlier. For example, with Henry's elder brother, Arthur, whom I mentioned to you briefly now, Arthur is born in Winchester in September 1486, and within 4 weeks, he is put into his own separate male-dominated household in Farnham, and he spends no time with his parents at all after that, save for high days and holidays. At the age of, let's get this right, at the age of 6, he's made regent of England, whilst his father goes off and fulfills the necessary rite de passage of a late medieval English king and goes off to biff the French. Henry VII doesn't do it very successfully. He's much better at biffing the English, but there we are. He goes off and biffs the French, and we would giggle at the thought of a 6-year-old as regent. It's purely formal, we would say, except that on an important series of acts of the council, Arthur's 6-year-old signature appears. Artur Princeps is there. And indeed, it's quite clear that his regency was seen as being so successful that about 18 months later, after having been regent of England, being Prince of Wales is considered a pure doddle. So he's actually sent off to run the devolved principality and to learn to be a king by being a prince, again in this totally masculinized household. And that's the normal means of upbringing. And what's very interesting is to look at the fact that this is clearly not simply an accident of Arthur being the elder son, Henry being the second son. It's a conscious following, as is normal in royal upbringings, of precedent. It's following the precedent of Henry's short-lived uncles, his mother's brothers, the princes in the Tower. Prince Edward, who rules briefly as Edward V, Richard, Duke of York, the younger son, and both of them, of course, meeting the common fate in the Tower, whatever it is, at the hands of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who makes himself Richard III on their dead or imprisoned or whatever happens to them. I think death is 99% certain bodies. And these two boys are brought up in exactly the same way. So the eldest is sent off to Wales. The youngest is kept at home and given again this dramatically feminized upbringing. And it's very striking, looking at contemporary descriptions of the two boys, that the one that people remember is Richard II's son, not Edward the older one. Because, of course, they've been familiar with Richard II's son at court. Whereas poor old Edward, indeed poor old Arthur, are sent off to Wales, so nobody's ever heard of them. It's a bit like Wales now. It's just about as far away and just about as inconvenient to get to, and the only time anybody who matters goes there is for the Hay Literary Festival, which is conveniently on the border. So Henry then is being brought up in this fashion, which is very odd, very strange, very important. Now, what also is not odd, not strange at all, of course, is that he's quickly given a tutor. The tutor, on the other hand, is a rather odd man. He is famous not as a teacher, not as a Latinist, which would be the kind of thing you'd expect, but as a poet. It's John Skelton. And Skelton is one of the most extraordinary figures of the early 16th century. If you've ever read any of his verse, it is quite bizarre. There's something almost modern about it. Strange, disjointed rhythms, intense use of alliteration, mixture of languages. It's a bit like Eliot at his worst, there's a sort of bit of Latin, a bit of French, a bit of German, except that it's mainly English and Latin woven together. All of it suggesting a very powerful, odd, domineering, idiosyncratic character. And what we know is then that Henry has this really very remarkable teacher when he's a young man. Whether he liked him or not is very unclear. He shows certainly no sign of gratitude to him as he gets older, much to Skelton's annoyance. But what is very striking is that we have, again, so many of Henry's school textbooks, things that he actually used when he was a boy. The first thing that's striking is the extent to which he is seriously inculcated into Latin. He is the first king, really, since Henry II, possibly since Alfred, who is seriously competent in the language. Competent enough not simply to be able to understand it, not simply to be able to understand a Latin writ or that sort of document, or the Bible or whatever, which was fairly commonplace, but to be able to read and write complex texts. So again, one of the key elements of Henry's upbringing is this unusually sophisticated education. For the first time, really, that a royal prince, again, his elder brother, was being given exactly the same sort of education. Very, very sophisticated, intense, but at the same time with a wide range of things. There's also a proper emphasis on foreign languages. There's also, what is very striking and actually really rather modern, a lot of history, including English history, with, of course, the history of Henry's own family, that turbulent, bloody history being at the centre of the story. Again, Skelton writes and adapts books for Henry. Henry learns French out of a French chronicle, which we've got, except that Skelton writes in the margin lots of rude comments about the French in Latin. So Henry is being taught French by a francophobe. And it's one of the really, and that which Henry himself absolutely turns out to be. Again, we also have a textbook on being a prince, how to be a prince, which Skelton writes for Henry, which is in itself a remarkable text. It has got one section which refers to his family history, which I've just mentioned to you now, which is extraordinarily blunt about it. It says, OK, your ancestry may be great. Most of them finished up horribly. And if you're not careful, you will. Henry is aware of this. It's also disarmingly frank. It begins, it's in Latin, of course, and it begins with an injunction to avoid gluttony. Well, when you look at what happens to him, he was already clearly a greedy little boy and saved only from his later fate by taking plenty of exercise. So there is then this remarkable teaching figure at the heart of Henry's boyhood. But of course, a royal prince couldn't perpetually remain simply cloistered, simply with women, simply with his tutor. And Henry finds himself unimportant at birth, suddenly projected into the world of politics and the terribly fraught world of princely power at the ripe age of 3.5. I just referred now to the fate of the princes in the Tower. Now, I can't compress the Wars of the Roses into 2 or 3 minutes, although I would have to if I were on television. That's the sort of thing that is best saved up for the front of the camera, and I'm sure most of you actually know the story. But the great story is, of course, that Henry's father, this strange adventurer that I've referred to, seizing the throne, coming totally from left field to become King of England, is the least likely possible candidate for the throne. There had been a long struggle in the 15th century between various factions, various divisions within the royal house that we summarise following a mixture of Shakespeare and Walter Scott as the Wars of the Roses, the House of Lancaster with the red rose, the House of York with the white rose, and Henry VII claiming, rather oddly, there is a line of descent, but it's a very bad one, to descend from the House of Lancaster, Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York, descending centrally from the House of York. But of course, the fact that Henry had stepped onto the throne, Henry VII had stepped onto the throne over the dead body of Richard III, that Richard III had stepped onto the throne over the dead bodies of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, that Edward V's father, Edward IV, had stepped onto the throne over the dead body of Henry VI, who had probably been bumped off by Richard, Duke of Gloucester. You get the story. Now, all of this produces a sense of illegitimacy, of fragility, of uncertainty as to who is rightful king. And of course, the fact that Henry VII had been able to come from absolute left field and seize the throne of England with 2,500 troops. It took the French no more. They didn't even need to call an Estates General. They called the Provincial Estates of Normandy. They were able to finance the seizure of the English throne out of that. It's that small. Now, that means, of course, lots and lots of other people think that they can do the same, which is why you get the so-called waves of pretenders in that wonderful textbook on English history, 1066 and all that. And you get the Lambert Simnels and the key figure, Perkin Warbeck. And Warbeck, interestingly, claims to be Henry's younger uncle, the uncle that people remembered, Richard, Duke of York. And he is first hailed as such in Ireland, the source of most of the troubles in England, right through the Middle Ages and the early modern period. I remember vividly, I mentioned Geoffrey Elton once already, he threw us all in our final examinations at Cambridge by setting the following question. All the important events in the English Civil War happened in Ireland. Discuss. Still branded upon my memory, as one's desperate attempts at answering it. He's first hailed as being Richard, Duke of York in Cork. He very quickly goes over to the Netherlands, then first to France and then to the Netherlands, where, again, his title is legitimated, he is honoured, he is received and treated seriously as a royal prince. And as he continues through the Netherlands, England's principal trading partner and very dynastically closely connected with England, Henry's father, Henry VII, gets more and more alarmed. And he decides if there is this false Duke of York, this pretender as Duke of York, then what he'd better do is to create his second son, again following the precedent of Richard, Duke of York, create him as Duke of York. And so, in November, on All Saints' Day, all royal ceremonies, remember, all medieval royal ceremony is religious. Every key major event takes place on a great saint's day. The most important business day at court is Sunday. Right? You look at Henry's whole itinerary, it's governed by the great feasts of the church. So on All Saints' Day, 1494, Henry, in a magnificent ceremony, completely different from the rather hole-in-corner ceremony of baptism which he'd received at Greenwich 3.5 years before, Henry is created in Westminster, in the heart of government. He is created Duke of York. And he's also knighted. He's created a Knight of the Bath. And we have this full, wonderful description of the ceremonies in which, Andrew and I were actually on camera as we did it, it is again a sort of 80 to 90% certainty that Henry, as an adult, corrected this account of his first youthful induction into ceremony. This highly characteristic hand appears on it. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because at the age of 3.5, Henry is clearly a star. He has a formal entry into London, and he rides alone 3.5 on a war horse. Now, that is simply amazing. It can be done, but it's normally a circus lad would do that kind of thing. But it shows, obviously, that the centrality of physical education, of chivalry, in the sense of horsemanship, to the upbringing of a prince at this point. And again, too, the ceremonies which Henry notes are ceremonies which have a kind of profound imaginative impact. They include, a nighttime vigil in the Holy Chapel of St. Stephen, a boy of 3.5. Being stripped off and bathed in this vastly elaborate ritual in which, at the culmination of it, his father, the king, comes, dips his hand in the water and gives him a second baptism into knighthood, makes the sign of the cross on his shoulder as the Lord Great Chamberlain of England recites the oaths of knighthood. 3.5-year-old boy. This, I don't know about you, I have memories from that age. And I think this is exactly what we're looking at with Henry. So, but it's not simply the sentimentalism and the splendour of knighthood, of ducal dignity, and so on. Of course, this also means that Henry becomes a very significant political player himself, and therefore a target. When Perkin Warbeck finally invades and makes serious moves to invade England in 1497, when there is a major revolt by the Cornish rebels, Henry is manifestly a target. And there's this extraordinary this extraordinary high summer of 1497 in which England is under attack in three directions: from Warbeck coming across the Channel, from the Cornish rebels coming from west to east, and from the Scots coming north-south. And Henry VII, the king, has thrown all his troops north to invade the Scots. And suddenly he finds himself under threat in the south. And he's only a handful of troops. He has to shadow the Cornish, and with, again, the threat of Warbeck joining them, as they march unimpeded across the whole of the south of England, moving nearer and nearer to where Henry is being brought up, not at Greenwich now, but at Eltham, the dependent palace just beyond. And the king has not sufficient forces. He can't stop the rebels as they're marching. He's still building up his army. And finally, it's Henry's mother, once again central to his upbringing, who rides out from London and rescues the little boy at Eltham and takes him back to the comparative safety of the Tower, by which time his father, the king, has got his troops lined up, and a great battle takes place on Blackheath, again, between Greenwich and Eltham and London. You see how all the geography is working out. And Henry's entire life hangs in the balance in those days. If his father had been defeated, there is no doubt whatever that Henry, Duke of York, would have shared the same fate as Richard, Duke of York. No doubt about it, whatever. Moreover, his mother, who's with him in the Tower, had been there twice before. She'd had to take refuge there when her father, Edward IV, is temporarily dethroned in 1470-71, and again in 1483 when Edward IV's brother rises against her brothers. Richard III rises against Edward and against the Duke of York. So Henry, I think, at that moment, by this time, of course, he's now 6, and Henry, I think, was taught, I can't prove it, but it seems to me to be 99% certain that Henry, at that moment, has his mother's direct experiences of her sufferings in the Wars of the Roses, of her position at the heart of the storm. As it happens, Warbeck is defeated. The Cornish are defeated first, then Warbeck is defeated. Henry and his father ride in triumph, and history remains the right way up, as we know. But Henry at this point now is moving, obviously, forward rapidly as a major political figure, but still a second rank. He would have been the first prince of the blood to his elder brother, King Arthur. That was what was intended. And he receives huge endowments, his education, his household gets bigger, and his education becomes more elaborate, his household gets bigger, and so on. But still he's the second string. And yet, it's quite clear that Henry's character impresses itself on people in a way which his brother Arthur's doesn't. And there is one of these extraordinary moments, one of the themes that I'm covering in this lecture, are the key figures. We've mentioned some of the key figures. Obviously, Henry's father, his mother, his grandmother. But the year 1499, when Henry is 8, is, I think, the moment at which a very different type of figure enters onto the stage. And I use the word stage quite deliberately. One of the things that's most striking about the 16th century experience is its staginess, is their sense of performance. A lot of people are worried now about what they call celebrity culture, about the desire for fame and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, there is nothing new about it at all. If you look at the great tapestry that we've got in Hampton Court, the great tapestry that we've got in the exhibition that comes from the V&A, and it's part of a set which is also to be found at Hampton Court. They're called the Triumphs, and they are the Triumphi. They are a series of triumphs of various virtues or various personifications. The one that we have in the exhibition, rather improbably, is chastity. But there's also the triumph for fame and so on. They were completely aware of our notion of fame. Once again, What's happened with the idea of fame is that we've democratized it. Then it was an aristocratic virtue. It belonged to a handful of the elite at the top of the society, either the intellectual top, artists and whatever, or more particularly writers, poets, consciously striving for fame, for reputation, for eternal glory, or the knightly and aristocratic elite. What we've done, is to reduce it to the crawling level of Simon Cowell and the strange creatures that come out of the woodwork on those reality TV shows. But the appetites are the same. Okay? And what happens with Henry in 1499 is that he confronts and meets some of the central figures in this conception of the goal of earthly human activity as fame. At Eltham, the palace where he is being brought up, the palace where Skilton dates the little textbook that he writes for Henry. Henry encounters, and it really is, again, I want to use the modern analogies, it's really very much like a sort of David Frost show, an old-fashioned David Frost show. You have Henry meeting Erasmus, being introduced to him by Thomas More at the age of 8. And what is striking is Erasmus's first visit to England, the great Dutch scholar, who himself is obsessed with the notion of fame and reputation. Henry is introduced to him. Henry teases him because Erasmus has failed to turn up with the collection of Latin verses, which was regarded as being an appropriate present. So Henry effectively sends the greatest scholar in Europe away to do his, at 8, sends the greatest scholar in Europe away to do his homework and to come back with the right verses. But Erasmus later on remembers the extraordinary he uses words that can only be translated as star quality. This boy standing on the stage, again, the literary description in Erasmus conforming exactly with what I've been talking about, the feminized upbringing, brought up with his sisters, surrounded by his sisters. There it's all described. But the boy standing at the centre of attention, with his elder sister Margaret as a kind of consort, with the younger sister Mary almost as though she were their children. It's a kind of family tableau. But all eyes on Henry, Henry himself in charge of the scene. There is clearly an awful lot of the future Henry, or indeed Henry's even more future daughter, Elizabeth, this same ability to hold a scene, to steal a show. And that's shown very conspicuously in the first great state event, apart from his own creation as Duke of York, that Henry is involved in. And that takes place another 2 years down the line, in 1501, when his elder brother Arthur, by this time 14 going on 15, is figured to be old enough to marry. And his wife, the negotiations have been going on, and since Arthur is just over a year old, is finally brought over to England, Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of the Catholic kings of Spain, Queen Isabella of Castile, queen in her own right, and her husband, Ferdinand of Aragon. Their youngest daughter is Catherine of Aragon. She is brought over to England in the autumn of 1491 in the teeth of incredible storms, which she later on regards as being prophetic. Poor woman, wouldn't she not? And she is married to Arthur in a grand, effectively televised ceremony in Old St. Paul's. The next time a Prince and Princess of Wales will marry in St. Paul's Cathedral, admittedly New St. Paul's, not Old St. Paul's, is Prince Charles and Princess Diana. And the wedding in 1501 is just as happy. Except that it's he who dies rather than she who dies. Otherwise, there's very little difference. Oh, and there are no kids. But when I say the wedding is televised, again, get a sense of what Tudor royal ceremony was about. It was designed to be seen. Why does it take place in Old St. Paul's? Because it's the biggest building in England. You could put roughly half the population of London into it. It would accommodate about 20,000. They construct a walkway at head height from the west doors to the steps of the altar. And along that, all the movements of the marriage ceremony take place. And in the middle, again on the model of a royal christening, they construct this huge multi-tiered stage, and the royal couple are married on top. And all the lesser clergy are told, keep your heads down, take your mitres off, get out of the way, make sure the people can see. We've actually got a handbook for this event, produced by the Lord Privy Seal, Richard Fox, the leading minister of the government, which anybody who has ever made a television film will recognise as a shooting script. There's everything there, where the musicians have got to be, who cues them, when the royal couple move, when they turn to greet the crowd, do they wave or do they not? All of that, it's scripted. It's a grand scripted public event. But who is the star? It's not the royal couple. It's not the royal couple, both of them in white. It's young Henry who escorts Catherine as effectively, bizarre thought, effectively as her father. And he escorts her up and down the church, and particularly at the court ball afterwards, he behaves, it must be said, really rather like Prince Harry, and takes his shirt off. I mean, he actually removes his gown to dance, which of course is regarded as an obscenity, the 16th century. But his parents, but I suppose, as parents of royal children do, sort of says, there, dear, aren't you marvellous? And again, you see this ready ability of Henry to steal the show. But of course, this is central in Henry's life in more than one way, because clearly, as I mentioned, Arthur is sent off to Wales. Catherine is sent off to Wales. They're sent off there to engender children. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Much nonsense is written about the relationship of Catherine and Arthur, but it is quite clear that the intention was that they slept together. There is every reason to believe that they did. Whether penetration occurred or whatever, we can never know. But the intention of the relationship is beyond any doubt whatever. And the documentation is there. It's available in my Six Wives book, where it's very fully set out. But Arthur dies. Why, how, is very unclear with 16th century medicine. It may have just been the rotten weather. Anybody who's been in Wales in spring knows what it can be like. It may have been that there was a bout of plague or sweating sickness. It could even have been testicular cancer, one which of course moves at galloping speed in young men. Certainly one of the accounts has been construed as meaning that. We don't know. All that matters is that Arthur is dead. And after they've waited for some months to make absolutely sure that Catherine is not pregnant with the next heir, Henry becomes Prince of Wales and heir, and at which point his life begins to transform, but not yet quite. He's still not taken to court, but the following year his mother dies in childbirth. And it's at that point, I think, that the real transformation in Henry's life happens. Suddenly this boy that's been held at arm's length from his father's court is taken to his father's court. And a court, of course, with a father who's changed from this extraordinary roving adventurer of his early youth into this careworn, prematurely aged king, aware that he's utterly unable to win the affection and love of his subjects, and therefore is determined to rule by a reign of fiscal terror. You get the idea. The Celts seem to be rather keen on this when they assume power in England. It's a very familiar pattern. And Henry is brought into this world. And there's also, of course, the great change following his mother's death, which Henry incidentally says a little later on in a letter to Erasmus is the most terrible thing that had ever happened to him. Henry also now finds himself with a radically different pattern of education. Skelton is instantly dismissed, and much more upfront, upmarket tutors are brought in. And Henry is now, I think, very much taught Latin in the full Erasmian mode, which is one of the reasons why, of course, 20 years later, when Henry struggles with the arguments to establish his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, to make himself head of the Church of England, he is actually able to deal with the most learned contemporary texts himself. He himself is in charge and at the heart of this process. And it's thanks to that final ratcheting up, if you like, his tertiary education that he'd received after he becomes heir to the throne. But also going on at this point are two other things that seem to me to be of absolutely crucial significance. Again, in the exhibition, really put into its historical context for the first time, is the religious document, Henry's own private aid to devotion. We've heard a little bit about his grandmother's Book of Hours. One of Henry's aids to devotion as a young man, these brief years that he's Prince of Wales, survives too, and is here in the exhibition. It's what's called a bead or prayer roll, and it's a very interesting cross between what we would regard to an aid to devotion and superstitious magic. It's got images of Christ in suffering Christ on the cross, saints undergoing excruciating agonies. If you've ever been, for example, to Spain and looked at the great altars, say the funeral chapel of Ferdinand and Isabella in Granada, you will see that every image on the altar is of some excruciating torture of a saint. Holiness is established by how slowly your guts were torn out, and this roll consists of this sort of thing, with prayers in Latin in black, and then English rubrics in red telling you how to treat these images. And how you're to treat them and how you're to say the prayers is the invocation of magic. If you say the prayers correctly, then a list of benefits is given to you. You say your paternosters and whatever, concentrating on the various bits of Christ's wounded body in the appropriate order, whereupon, eureka, you've saved 555 years, 423 days and 22 minutes out of purgatory. Or you're absolutely guaranteed that you won't be stabbed in the back. I imagine the entire cabinet has been sort of trooping into the exhibition and reading this particular section. Or if you're a woman, and again you do the prayer, and the roll is rolled up and put on your belly, you will have, and you're in childbirth, the child will be born alive and you will live until it's christened. Great. But this is magic. Now, what is clear is that the young Henry believes this stuff. This is the approach to religion, which the older Henry condemns absolutely. The young Henry is brought up with it. The final element that I would like to put into place in these years is, we've talked about Henry's education, and it really is important not to see it simply as Latin, however sophisticated it is. Henry's education is genuinely a broad one, replacing the sort of all-purpose skeleton. You now have specialist teachers. Henry is taught to speak French now by a native speaker. He has no fewer than 2 music tutors, one for the lute, one for stringed instruments, one for wind. He's got a physical education instructor who maybe he's perhaps the most influential person in Henry's upbringing, who's got the charming title of Master of Axes or Master at Axes. In other words, the training in the battle axe, the whole business of knightly combat. So Henry's upbringing is education is very, very wide. And it's the physical education side which I think is so important and is so easy to underestimate. Henry is growing up quickly now. He's in his early teens, and he's is manifest. He takes physically, not after his father, who was once nicely described by an old friend of mine as having the face of a Welsh miner, thin, spare, build, but he takes after his grandfather, Edward IV, whose body was exhumed in the 19th century. His coffin was opened in the 19th century at Windsor and measured, and was 6'3". In other words, once the cartilage is fully in place, he's 6'4". Henry is almost 6'1", and he's clearly pushing that when he's in his mid-teens, as many teenagers do. So he's this enormous boy, and of course that gives you very great advantages in heavy contact sport. And the heavy contact sport is what I would call rugby on horseback. That is to say, jousting. And remember, jousting is an unbelievably brutal but also skill-demanding contact sport. And if you don't believe me, go into the exhibition and try and aim a lance. We give you the opportunity of doing it. And imagine you're riding a galloping cart horse as you're doing it, and you're trying to look at your opponent through a slit which is less than ½ centimetre wide, okay? Remembering, of course, to jerk your head up at the origin of the expression, chin up, clearly, at the moment of contact. Otherwise, the lance will go straight through and you will die of a penetration of the eye and the optic nerve. Very unpleasant. Unbelievably vigorous sport. Henry the leading jousters enjoy the kind of prestige of a modern soccer player. And we've got these descriptions of the young Prince Henry champing at the bit, urgently wanting to take place. Part. His father won't let him. Obviously, the whole life of the dynasty depends on this one boy. It's too much of a risk. Nevertheless, he's allowed to train and to mingle with these people. And what is the most extraordinary thing is who they are politically. Again, it's this very interesting way in which now we're used to our sports stars coming from the bottom of society rather than the top. Then they came from the top. And the great star jousters of the court of Henry's father, interestingly enough, are all minor members and connections of the dispossessed royal house, the House of York. So Henry, Duke of York, son of Elizabeth of York, is spending all his time with these sporting buddies who are minor members of the House of York. What is going on is unbelievably difficult to work out. Was his father doing it intentionally? Didn't he know? Didn't he care? Was he too busy doing the accounts? What was going on? We can't be sure. But what it means is that Henry builds up something that I think no king of England, or no future king of England, had had since the days of Henry V, nearly a century before. He had a range of ready-made contacts with important members of the political elite, established in the way which only boys and men can, by fighting and scrapping with each other. And remember, this is an aristocratic culture. It's essentially about violence and conflict, which is why, of course, something like Romeo and Juliet can adapt so easily to black culture, with Porgy and Bess and whatever. That's why the two things, gang culture, rap culture, the values of rap culture are identical to high aristocratic culture. And Henry is central and a part of this. So this is the kind of young prince who is going to become king. And it happens relatively quickly. His father is progressively sicker and sicker in 1506, 1507, 8, and then finally dies in 1509. And strikingly, at Richmond, at his favourite palace of Richmond, one of the nicest things that we have in the exhibition is a drawing of his deathbed, showing exactly who is there. And it is not the great figures of the reign, it is the equivalent of the Mandelsons and the Campbells. It's the figures of the Privy Chamber and the royal doctors who are marked out by the fact they're all holding urinal bottles. I mean, urine is and the testing of urine is absolutely central to medicine then, as indeed it is now. But what is important about it is the death happens behind closed doors. It's kept secret for 48 hours, whilst his father's counsellors fight themselves to the death, something we're going to see very shortly, as the struggle for the succession takes place. And two of them, Empson and Dudley, particularly associated with the kind of qualities of fiscal rapacity, dishonesty, of hasty changes of tax rates, of invocation of dead law. Nothing is new in history, of dead laws and all the rest of it. They are arrested and packed off to the Tower, and young Prince Henry is able to sail to the throne on a wave of popular acclaim. Campbell, Cameron, Johnson, who knows? Anyway, there is a new world. But what is very striking about is looking at Henry in that new world. The reception that Henry enjoys, with Thomas More, who's clearly known Henry now for over 10 years, acting as cheerleader, is very much like Obama. He's 17 years and 10 months. He's greeted as walking on water. The same language is used, the language drawn from the book of Revelations about correcting wrongs, drying tears, comforting the afflicted, pulling down the overmighty. All of this stuff, we all want to believe it. But Henry, extraordinarily, does deliver. This 17-year-old boy, 17 years, 10 months, immediately begins to restore his jousting companions, these neglected, oppressed, dispossessed members of the House of York. And he does it successfully. And it's quite extraordinary. The Wars of the Roses, in other words, aren't ended on Bosworth Field in 1485 by Henry VII. They're ended in 1509 by the not yet 18-year-old Henry VIII. And what we've got to do is to look at how this youthful paragon, this king who was musical, who was poetical, who was aspiring to virtue, who proclaimed that he'd married for love, who announced through his director of studies, Lord Mountjoy, that all he was interested in was virtue, glory, immortality, who was seriously religious. We've got to explain in the next two lectures how that turned into the Henry that we remember.